Chapter 15. When We Crossed the Rubicon. The crucial event in the history of our species involved crossing the threshold into a regime of cumulative cultural evolution, which has driven human genetic evolution ever since. This is the process that made us uniquely human, but I have not said much about when our lineage made the crossing. When did our ancestors first begin to possess bodies of know-how or tools of sufficient complexity that no single individual could have invented it from scratch on his or her own in one lifetime? Well, first, there's no reason to suspect it was a singular moment or event. Instead, our lineage probably danced around the starting line for a long time. One group would cross the threshold and begin to very slowly accumulate cultural know-how, only to have those cultural products lost when the group was broken up or decimated by environmental shifts, diseases, or conflicts with nearby groups. Setbacks would also result from migrations to new environments or environmental changes, because any emerging cultural adaptations might not fit the new circumstances, or the relevant materials or resources might not be available. For example, groups might learn to control, but not start, fires for cooking. Once they move away from their natural fire sources, and their fires go out in a rainstorm, that's it. No more fire. Or a little cumulative cultural evolution might create a nice stone chopper made from a certain kind of volcanic rock. But once the group migrated to a new region, perhaps driven there by climatic shifts, they'd lose access to that type of rock and eventually forget how to make those choppers. With low-quality imitative abilities, error-prone copying, social intolerance, and little or no teaching, accumulating and sustaining cultural adaptations would have been very delicate in the early days. So, when were these early days? To triangulate in on them, we have three main lines of evidence. Studies of living apes, when used with care, can help us make inferences about what our last common ancestor with chimpanzees was like. That's our starting point. From there, we rely on detailed analyses of the stones and bones unearthed by paleoanthropologists, which permit us to infer aspects of the lives and abilities of our ancestors and how these have changed through time. Finally, comparative studies of genes from humans, apes, and even ancient DNA taken from bones helps us figure out which genes have changed and how they've changed. From analyses of these bones, stones, and genes, we'll look for evidence of cumulative cultural evolution and map out a crude and, admittedly, quite speculative timeline. Let's start at the beginning. How cultural was our common ancestor with chimpanzees? Genetic evidence indicates that our lineage split from the line leading to chimpanzees between 5 and 10 million years ago. Since neither chimpanzees nor any other primate have any significant cumulative culture, it's a good bet that our last common ancestor also lacked cumulative culture and wasn't any more cultural than modern chimpanzees. The upshot of this is that we can immediately put down a bookend. Our last common ancestor with chimpanzees who lived 5 to 10 million years ago had not crossed the threshold to cumulative cultural evolution. After about 4 million years ago, the bones tell us that an ape that walked on 2 legs, with a brain somewhat larger than a chimpanzee, appeared in Africa. There are a number of species of these apes, but for simplicity I'll refer to them collectively as Australopiths. We don't have tools that can be directly and uncontroversially connected to these guys, but we do have 3 kinds of indirect evidence. One, their brain size combined with data on what bigger brains usually imply for primates. Two, cut marks made by stone tools on animal bones. And three, anatomical changes in their hands, which fit into the account I developed in chapters 5 and 13 on the coevolution of tools and dexterity. Let's start with brain size. Both field and laboratory studies suggest that primates with larger brains are better at individual learning, social learning, and several other cognitive skills. Among large-brained apes like chimpanzees and orangutans, this research suggests that greater social learning leads to more frequent tool use. Young chimpanzees are more likely to learn to use probes to extract termites, ants, and honey from otherwise difficult-to-access locations, and to use stone or wooden hammers to crack nuts open, if they can be with others who are doing these activities. At least one group of chimpanzees even adds a brush head to stick probes that helps them to more efficiently extract termites. Since Australopiths had somewhat bigger brains than chimpanzees, 440 cubic centimeters versus 390, we can infer that Australopiths were better at social learning and were thus probably using more tools, more often, and in more kinds of tasks than any living ape. Tool use by Australopiths was also likely enhanced by the fact that they were primarily ground dwellers, discussed in Chapter 16, who walked comfortably on two legs instead of knuckle walking like living apes, so they would have had an easier time carrying tools around. About 3.4 million years ago in Ethiopia, somebody was using stone tools to cut and scrape the meat off a cow-sized ungulate, like a horse or zebra, and a goat-sized bovid, think baby antelope. Stones were also used to smash open bones to get at the rich and nutritious marrow inside. Based on the current evidence about who inhabited this region of Ethiopia at that time, it was probably Australopiths doing this food processing. Now, we don't know if these were stones used as tools or if they were stone tools. That is, stones that had been crafted to have sharp edges or other useful features. The Australopiths might have simply searched around for sharp-edged stones and used those. As a point of reference, chimpanzees do use stones to smash open nuts, but they don't use stones to butcher the animals they kill, and they do hunt, nor do they use stones to crack open bones to get marrow. They also don't get access to anything the size of a cow, so they hunt only small game. Roughly 200,000 years later, fossils from an ancient hand suggest that the use of such stones as tools may already have been at work shaping the evolution of the anatomy of some Australopith species, tinkering away via natural selection to improve their precision grip. This is the delicate grip between our thumbs and fingers that we use to carefully manipulate tools. It's the configuration that allows us, but not other apes, to thread a needle and to effectively craft stone tools, which were soon to appear in the paleoarchaeological record. Unlike chimpanzees, the thumbs of, at least, some Australopiths had lengthened and the fingertips had widened, which substantially improves precision grip. The bones also show an attachment area for a muscle called the flexor pollicis longus. This muscle, which strengthens the thumb when flexing, is either missing or underdeveloped in living apes. Alongside these changes are others that stabilized, strengthened, and honed the precision grips of Australopiths, including adjustments that gave their hands the distinctive human ability to cup and to perform other kinds of grasping movements that apes cannot. These anatomical adjustments in Australopiths appear to be a co-evolutionary response to a world in which making and using tools is already more important than anything we see in living apes. Of course, we need to remain skeptical. This need not be culture-driven genetic evolution. The tools that drove this evolutionary change in the hands of our ancestors may be purely a product of individual smarts. Maybe each Australopith is figuring out how to make tools by himself or herself, and social learning played no role. This is possible, but it would mean these apes were unlike both other living apes and humans, whose use of tools, even simple ones, is increased by social learning. By 2.6 million years ago, the first stone tools appear in the paleoarchaeological record. Known as Oldowan tools, after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, these are not just stones used as tools, but stones crafted and shaped to be choppers, scrapers, hammerstones, and awls. Detailed analyses and experiments that involve making and using new versions of these tools suggest that different tools were variously specialized for cutting the meat off of large mammals, breaking bones open to access the marrow, scraping hides, cracking nuts, and slicing through tough grasses or reeds. The remains of animal bones left at these sites makes it clear that these guys weren't just messing around. They were butchering giraffes, springboks, buffaloes, and even the occasional elephant. These tools were made from a variety of stone materials, including obsidian, limestone, and quartz, which were often transported 10 to 20 kilometers from their source. Keep in mind, as I go along, that I'm giving the current earliest dates for these tools and anatomical changes. Since the chances that researchers happen to find the actual earliest case of anything is, for all practical purposes, 0, we can be fairly confident that whatever we are talking about probably emerged before the date given. The earliest Oldowan tools don't look impressive, but they are deceptively difficult to learn to make well. The percussive blows used to make them require accurate and powerful targeting at the correct angle. Skilled Oldowan toolmakers, even at this primitive level, needed to have mastered multiple techniques with different materials, including the ability to repair stone cores, which are routinely damaged during the manufacturing process. Even when tutored by human experts and motivated by the need for a cutting edge to access some food, apes cannot learn to make stone tools in the manner or with the skill of the Oldowan toolmakers. The famous language-trained bonobo, a type of chimpanzee, Kanzi, was given stones and shown the Oldowan technique by an expert human stone knapper. Kanzi, however, lacked the dexterity to use the technique, so he invented his own approach, which involved using his full force to smash the stone into the floor or another stone. He would then search the refuse for any stone pieces with a sharp cutting edge. These edges got the particular job done that he wanted, but analyses of the stone assemblages he created show they lack many of the key features of Oldowan stone tools. By around 2.4 million years ago, a bigger-brained, about 630 cubic centimeters, bipedal ape appeared in Africa. These apes, and there may have been more than one species, are typically considered the first members of our genus, Homo, so I'll refer to them collectively as early Homo. Early Homo had smaller jaws and cheek teeth, which had thinner enamel. These characteristics suggest that their anatomy was responding to the spread of know-how about food processing, of which those Oldowan tools likely played a role. Stone tools probably accompanied wooden tools, which were part of a body of cultural expertise. Such know-how would have facilitated locating and digging up underground tubers and roots, scavenging and processing, cutting, chopping, and pulverizing, meat and bone marrow, and finding and extracting termites, ants, eggs, rodents, and honey. Knowledge of seasonal spawning, along with clubs and simple spears, may have permitted early Homo to obtain large fish, because fish bones appear in many early sites. Similarly, turtle shells suggest that early Homo may have figured out how to flip turtles and then penetrate their shells. The access to and processing of these richer resources would have opened the door for brain expansion, as new energy sources became available and less energy was needed for the grinding, cutting, and chopping done by big teeth and jaws, or for the slow breakdown and digestion that occurs in the mouth, stomach, and small intestines. At some point during this early phase, the gene MYT16 probably got switched off in our lineage by a mutation on chromosome 7. In living primates, this gene helps build the massive muscles that wrap around primate skulls and allow them to chew tough foods and to bite really hard. In humans, this gene is deactivated because we no longer need the high-powered muscle fibers that it helps build. This genetic deactivation would have been selected for in an ape only if that ape had the tools and techniques for acquiring high-quality foods or for processing them, using stone choppers, as well as for offense and defense, spears, clubs, thus making those big jaw muscles merely extra baggage. Because such muscles are costly to maintain, natural selection will drop them if it can, if it has another solution. Australopiths are interesting in this domain because some species, which coexisted with early Homo, developed massive jaws and teeth. This change suggests that natural selection solved a similar food processing problem in later Australopiths via powerful jaws and teeth that cultural evolution was solving in Homo. There is reason to suspect that the overall body of technical skills and know-how was actually much larger than merely making and using stone tools. By 1.8 million years ago, it appears that someone was using bones and horns as tools, perhaps even sharpening these on stones. Careful analyses of the wear on these bones suggest that they were likely used for digging, which probably included opening up termite mounds and excavating subterranean roots and tubers. Some appear polished, possibly having been rubbed against an animal hide. To be clear, these are not the finely crafted bone implements that later signal a rapidly expanding body of Paleolithic cultural knowledge. Nevertheless, they do suggest that the accumulation of bone know-how began early. These bits of evidence also point to what I think is an obvious inference. Both early Homo, and at least some Australopiths, must have had a rich repertoire of tools made from wood, reeds, and hides, not to mention other kinds of socially learned expertise. Amazingly, we can also make some inferences about the ancient brains of our ancestors around 2 million or more years ago. Analyses of Oldowan tools suggest that 90% of these tool makers were right-handed. This is odd because apes don't have a preferred hand, and our handedness comes from a division of labor between our brain hemispheres, with the left half focusing on language and tool use in most people. Consistent with this, early Homo skulls tentatively suggest an expansion in regions known to be important for speech, gesture, and tool use, and show an emerging physical separation between the hemispheres. It seems the neurological division of labor that characterizes modern human brains may have already begun to emerge in a pattern consistent with a culture-driven response to the presence of tools and the synergy between tools for things like processing food and those for communicating. Let's return to our interspecies game of Survivor from Chapter 1. Would you have known how to knap stone flakes to aid you in cutting the tough hide and thick tendons on an animal carcass? Would you have known which type of rock to use and where to find it? You can't just pick up any old rock, and chucks of flints, quartzite, and chert are not usually just lying around. Experiments show that humans are massively aided by opportunities for cultural transmission in learning to make stone tools. However, I suspect that given enough free time and motivation, you could eventually figure all this out. This means that this skill alone is probably not cumulative cultural evolution, at least for us modern humans, since the products of cumulative cultural evolution are sufficiently complex that single individuals cannot figure them out in their lifetime. Of course, it would still be much less costly for you if you could learn from an expert. Nevertheless, for our small-brained ancestors, such tools and techniques would probably have been much harder to figure out by themselves, so these might have constituted cumulative cultural products. In this light, Alduin tools might have persisted and at times been widespread because they were usually socially learned and possible for a single individual to occasionally invent on his own. What unifies Alduin tools as a type is the use of an artificial, conchoidal, fracturing technique on certain stone types. Under the right conditions, with the right types of stone around, it's plausible that smart terrestrial apes would have figured out this technique. Once produced, other individuals could then have acquired it by social learning, making it more common. The tools persisted through time because, even though populations may have collectively lost the technique and know-how from time to time, someone would soon have reinvented them, and then they would have spread locally again. This process could have happened repeatedly. My sense is that, at this point, we are seeing populations that were dancing on the threshold of cumulative cultural evolution. Forms of social learning were probably important to them for acquiring skills and know-how, and the consequence is that groups had much more know-how than they would have had without such learning. At this stage, social learning may have permitted individuals to acquire different kinds of adaptive know-how about things such as making stone tools, sharpening bones, and locating key resources, like spawning fish or nesting turtles, than they could have otherwise acquired on their own. But such learning didn't yet permit the sustained accumulations that generate sophisticated tools or complex cultural packages. Any particular cultural adaptation could be figured out in one lifetime, but all of them probably couldn't. Accumulations come 2 steps forward, but then go 2 steps backward, because groups split up, environmental shocks hit, or bad luck strikes. If this is the case, we should expect the archaeological record to show variation among sites, with some sites revealing more complex technologies than others. However, we shouldn't expect a continuous trend toward greater complexity over time. The former is what it would look like when groups are dancing on the threshold of cumulative cultural evolution. Based on current readings of the Alduin data by some researchers, this may be the case. Different groups at different times used different knapping strategies and preferred different stone types. Some groups even made superior choppers, which were sharpened to an edge by flaking both sides. But any trend of improvement over time in stone tools is somewhere between fuzzy and non-existent, from 2.6 million years ago to roughly 1.9 million years ago. By 1.8 million years ago, selection pressures generated by culture gene coevolution had intensified, and the pace of change picked up. In Africa, and then rapidly across Eurasia, a new species of the genus Homo was on the move with bigger brains, 800 cubic centimeters, a much more modern physique, including a narrower pelvis and longer legs, and often fancier stone tools. For simplicity, I will refer to all varieties of these guys, whether in Asia, Africa, or Europe, as Homo erectus. The anatomy of Homo erectus indicates that he'd become dependent on food processing, as discussed in Chapter 5. Compared to early Homo, his cheek teeth, face, and jaws are smaller, all of which indicates that he had less tough chewing to do. Stomachs and intestines don't fossilize, but rib cages and the surrounding bones sometimes do. Erectus had a barrel-shaped rib cage, like us, which is unlike the funnel-shaped rib cages of chimpanzees and gorillas. This anatomy implies that Erectus had lost the large guts that apes have and use to digest the raw foods they eat. Thus, Erectus was becoming increasingly addicted to some combination of the high-quality, hard-to-get, processed foods our species depends on. The cultural products that facilitate this evolutionary change likely included 1. The weapons, strategies, and skills for hunting and scavenging large game; 2. The manufacturing skills, tools, and know-how for butchering big animals; and 3. The knowledge and techniques to locate and unearth underground tubers and roots, or obtain honey. There's also a good case to be made that Erectus had some control of fire, and perhaps cooked. How often and how much Erectus depended on fire is a running debate, but there's some evidence of fire by around 1.5 million years ago, better evidence at 1 million years ago, and good evidence of both cooking and fire at around 800,000 years ago. In Africa, Homo erectus co-emerges in the paleoarchaeological record with new large stone tools, which are distinct from Alduin tools in that the former required that large stone slabs of certain materials be quarried. Once these blanks, as they are termed, are created, they can be worked on one or both sides to produce hand axes, cleavers, and picks. Making these tools was getting pretty complex, especially if you include locating the stone, which is often far away, quarrying and transporting the large blanks, and then actually crafting the axe, cleaver, or pick. Just the final part, knapping the blanks, seems to require hundreds of hours for modern humans to learn, even with help. It's far from clear how often an individual could figure all this out on their own in a lifetime. Despite their larger brains, lost European explorers in need of cutting edges didn't just quickly whip up some stone hand axes. In small-scale societies, populations that still make stone tools, which have been studied by anthropologists, rely on years of both cultural transmission and individual practice to make quality stone axes or adzes. And precisely how one quarries those large stone blanks is not obvious, to say the least. During this period, anatomical changes in the shoulders and wrists of Homo erectus suggest the emergence of powerful throwing abilities, a skill useful in hunting, scavenging, and attacking other people. Only humans can throw fast and accurately. By contrast, although chimpanzees do occasionally throw stuff, their tosses are slow and usually inaccurate compared to their physically weaker cousins, us. However, since early throwers probably threw rocks and simple spears, it's not immediately obvious that the evolution of the anatomical adjustments for throwing would have been powerfully spurred by cultural evolution. However, here's the thing. Humans don't automatically develop powerful and accurate throwing. People who don't practice throwing while growing up, like most girls in my elementary school, turn out to be rather bad throwers as adults. Now imagine that you are a child growing up in a world where no one throws things, or when they occasionally do, their throws are slow and off target. You might experiment with throwing rocks or sticks at small game or birds, but you'd very likely miss, get frustrated, and give up to pursue some more fruitful avenue. But if you could watch and emulate older models who successfully brought down birds with fast and accurate pitches, you'd be more likely to persevere through a long period of practice. You also might notice some of the older kids engaging in target practice, which you could copy. Of course, these observations will influence you only if you are a keen cultural learner. To get a throwing tradition off the ground, one or a few unusual or lucky individuals would have to persevere through the practice period without relying on cultural learning. But that's a much less demanding requirement than needing everyone to develop throwing on their own. So cultural evolution could have created conditions favorable to throwing as a learned practice without having to first create fancy projectiles. Similarly, as described in Chapter 5, the presence of a combination of know-how related to animal behavior and tracking, as well as the making and use of water containers, may have opened the door for Erectus to engage in long-distance persistence hunting or scavenging. Although some of the anatomical adaptations for endurance running appear in early Homo, Erectus is loaded with them, including most notably long legs, narrow hips, a large butt, and better heat loss from the head. Things accelerated from 1.6 to 1 million years ago as new techniques and materials increasingly appeared among the remains of Erectus societies. Hand axes, including those from the same site, go from mostly worked on one side, unifacial, to being worked on both sides, bifacial. These axes got more refined over time, showing greater symmetry and sharper edges, and are sometimes made of large bones. Experimental efforts by modern stone knappers reveal that these ancient tools imply the spread of new techniques that were being added to an expanding knapping repertoire. The new techniques require more complex recipes, including procedures that prepare the stone for knapping. As one would expect if cumulative culture was just emerging, there were both variations in techniques and practices across sites, but also uneven accumulations, with technological disappearances being common. Sometimes, even frequently, the large and distinctive hand axes vanished from the record, leaving only simpler stone tools, Aldewan. Populations could lose techniques and their associated tools if they lost contact with the relevant raw materials for a generation or two. And, as with other cultural adaptations, we also should expect fire control and cooking to drop out of the repertoire of specific groups for periods of time. As noted earlier, Chapter 5, the knowledge of how to make fire even occasionally dropped out of the repertoire of modern hunter-gatherers. By 1.4 million years ago, anatomical evidence from fossil finger bones indicates another response to the increasing importance of tools and new tool-related techniques on our lineage's fine dexterity and precision grip. The base of Erectus's middle finger had been reshaped to be indistinguishable from ours and different from that of living apes and the Australopiths. The new design stabilizes the joint while making a precision grip and reinforces the whole hand and wrist. Although researchers have long argued for an immense period of stasis in the tools and know-how of Erectus, the emerging evidence is beginning to indicate that this may not be the case. By 850,000 years ago, Erectus, now with a bit larger brain, is sometimes thinning his large cutting tools and creating greater symmetry. Efforts to reconstruct the techniques used in preparing these beautiful tools suggest the use of a soft hammer technique, which would have required first making a soft hammer out of bone or antler. Such a change would have required the use of longer procedures with more steps and greater technical skill. A bit later, it also appears that different sites used different manufacturing methods and quite different materials to achieve the same ends. After about 900,000 years ago, the pace of environmental fluctuations picked up. Based on mathematical modeling, this change should have increased the selection pressures for social learning, especially in a species already somewhat dependent on culture. However, shifting environments would have also impeded, stifled, and sometimes set back cumulative cultural evolution. As cultural evolution built adaptations attuned to local circumstances and resources, more frequent environmental shifts would have rendered these cultural adaptations useless by changing the available plants and animals and altering local weather patterns. Populations would have inhabited environments for several hundred years, building up a suite of cultural adaptations, only to have to move or readapt after an environmental shift. Under such conditions, we should expect more complex cultural products to pop up from time to time, but it should be patchy, with lots of fits and starts. Since fancy tools, for example, are not the direct product of Erectus's big brains or intelligence, any more than our fancy tools are a product of our own smarts, we shouldn't expect to see equally fancy tools everywhere he went. Reference chapter 12. We shouldn't expect this any more than we would expect the early European explorers who sailed across the globe after 1500 CE to have encountered societies with equal levels of technological complexity or sophistication. Generating and sustaining technological complexity requires collective brains linked by social networks and galvanized by social norms. Nevertheless, the signature of cumulative cultural evolution seems to emerge at certain times and places. For example, between the Golan Heights and the Galilee Mountains, Israel, on the shores of an ancient lake, the site of Gesher Benot Yaakov has yielded rich insights into the life of one society around 750,000 years ago. The extensive remains indicate the existence and persistence of hearths and areas for both stone tool manufacturing and food processing. The inhabitants controlled fire and made a variety of stone tools, including hand axes, cleavers, blades, knives, awls, scrapers, and choppers. Made from flint, basalt, and limestone, tool manufacture was done on site, often from giant slabs carried in from a distant quarry by a team. Some of the basalt slabs have notches, indicating the use of levers as part of the quarrying process. The basalt is of the highest quality and well quarried, suggesting that someone had a storehouse of know-how on the topic. The group's diet was diverse and also would have required extensive local knowledge. The stone tools were used to process the carcasses of elephants, deer, gazelles, and rhinos, as well as boars and rodents. The cut marks left on deer bones are not much different from the same marks made hundreds of thousands of years later by late Paleolithic hunters. The inhabitants of Gesher Benot Yaakov also, somehow, obtained freshwater crabs, turtles, reptiles, and at least 9 types of fish, including carp, sardines, and catfish. Some of these fish were big, longer than a meter. On top of this, there were seeds, acorns, olives, grapes, nuts, water chestnuts, and various other fruits. This bounty included the submerged prickly water lily, which grows well away from shore. It also appears that they were cracking nuts open and roasting acorns to remove their shells and perhaps reduce the bitter tannins. They may even have made popcorn, by roasting the seeds from the prickly water lily, as has been done for thousands of years in India and China. Clearly, cumulative cultural evolution is up and running at this point, generating more know-how than you, me, or our lost European explorers could have ginned up in a lifetime. If you aren't sure, go quarry some high-quality basalt slabs. You'll need a lever, I think. Make a beautiful hand axe with full symmetry. Remember to make that antler or bone hammer first. Bring down an elephant. Trust your Paleolithic instincts. Butcher the carcass. Use the hand axe. Make a fire or find naturally occurring flame, and then whip up a raft to paddle out and pick some prickly water lily. You can spot this plant, right? Then enjoy the elephant steaks and popcorn. Of course, this is not to imply that these ancient humans were like us, but merely that they had crossed the Rubicon and embarked on a genetic evolutionary trajectory that was primarily driven by culture and its products. If you have any remaining skepticism that the cumulative cultural evolutionary threshold has been crossed by this point, in the next 300,000 years after the activities at Gesher Benot Yaakov, Homo erectus changed sufficiently, including a brain expansion to 1,200 cubic centimeters, to justify a new species name, Homo heidelbergensis. This period revealed the first evidence of projectile weapons, including wooden throwing spears with stone points, and the emergence of a variety of techniques for producing stone blades. These techniques are consistent within sites or populations, but did vary between populations. Distinct tool traditions and composite tools that exploited natural glues weren't far behind. Heidelbergensis also appears to have had ears calibrated like humans to speech sounds, unlike other apes, which suggests that a culturally evolved spoken communicative repertoire had been hammering away at our genes. Reference chapter 13. Now, many of these bits of know-how and technologies seem to drop in and out of the record, and don't make a sustained and enduring appearance until the last 100,000 years. But this is just what you'd expect in a species dependent on a collective brain that was subject to shifting environments, intergroup competition, and challenging ecologies that constrained group size and fractured the social ties between bands. The upshot of all this is that, based on current evidence, Australopiths probably began to aggregate cultural information more intensively than any other living ape, except us, but that no particular tool or element of know-how was more sophisticated than an individual could invent in his or her lifetime. However, taken together, these aggregations may have, at certain times and places, been more than any one individual could have figured out. These populations, however, likely stood on the precipice of true cumulative cultural evolution, with slow advances and common retreats. This aggregation of cultural know-how drove the evolution of early Homo, expanding his brain and reducing his teeth and jaws. By 1.8 million years ago, however, the threshold had probably been crossed, and cumulative cultural evolutionary products were driving the genetic evolution of our genus, shaping our feet, legs, guts, teeth, and brains. Albeit slow by later standards, toolkits improved and techniques were added gradually, though, of course, cultural losses and technological setbacks continued, and would continue into the modern world. By 750,000 years ago, at Gesher Benot Yaakov, there's little doubt that we are dealing with a cultural species who hunts large game, catches big fish, maintains hearths, cooks, manufactures complex tools, cooperates in moving giant slabs, and gathers and processes diverse plants. The bottom line: cumulative cultural evolution is old in our species lineage, dating back at least hundreds of thousands of years, but probably millions of years. Now, let's explore why it was our lineage that crossed the Rubicon.